The document made a soft sound when it crossed the table. That was the part Marcellus Dade-Okonkwo remembered most, later. Not the silence that followed, not the particular quality of the fluorescent light in Reuben Achara Finch's conference room, but the sound of paper sliding across polished wood. Barely a whisper. For something that cost him 3 years of maneuvering, he had expected it to be louder. He watched his sister's face the way a man watches a door he expects to swing open. Seraphine Dade-Okonkwo looked down at the amendment, a single page, signed, dated 3 weeks before their mother Celestia's death, redirecting the full estate to Marcellus, and she did not flinch. She did not cry. She did not ask to see the notary stamp or demand Reuben explain the provenance. She simply looked at it the way a doctor looks at a scan she has already interpreted, a long, measuring look. And then she looked up at her brother. Marcellus took that look for resignation. He would spend a great deal of time, later, wishing he had been a more careful reader. To understand what happened in that room, you have to understand what Marcellus Dade-Okonkwo believed about himself in the weeks before it. He was 38 years old. He had their mother's broad forehead and their father's stubbornness, and a wardrobe full of dress shirts that fit him almost correctly. Close enough to look intentional, not quite right enough to look effortless. He carried a worn leather portfolio everywhere, a habit formed in his late 20s when he was trying to look like a man who had documents worth protecting. By now, the habit had outlasted the documents. He carried it the way some men carry a particular posture, because putting it down would require admitting something. He had loved his mother. That part was true and should be said plainly. Celestia Dade had raised 2 children alone after their father left, in a house on a street where the elm trees grew too close to the power lines and nobody ever trimmed them back. She had worked as a records administrator for 31 years. She had a pearl brooch she wore to every occasion that required one, and eyes that cataloged everything they saw, and a way of saying your name that let you know exactly how much of your nonsense she had already accounted for. She had died in February. She had left a will. And Marcellus had decided, some months before she died, that the will was not going to say what he needed it to say, so he had made arrangements. He told himself this was correcting an oversight. Their mother had always leaned on Seraphine for the practical things, the appointments, the phone calls, the paperwork, and Marcellus had always understood this as proximity, not preference. He was the one she called when she wanted to laugh. He was the one she told her stories to. Surely that counted for something. Surely the estate, the house, the accounts, the 31 years of careful accumulation should reflect what they actually were to each other. Reuben Achara Finch had said very little during the meeting. He was the kind of attorney who had delivered enough bad news that the delivering of it no longer registered on his face. He reviewed the amendment. He noted the signature. He said he would need to file the appropriate documents with the probate court and that both parties should expect correspondence within 30 days. He did not look at Seraphine when he said this. Back in the conference room, Seraphine stood. She gathered her coat from the back of her chair, unhurried, precise, the way she did everything, and she said the only thing she would say to her brother that afternoon. "Mom told me to let you have it, Marcellus. She said you'd need it more than I would." She did not raise her voice. She did not sign a counter-document. She did not ask Reuben to pause the proceedings. She simply walked out of the room, and the door closed behind her with the same soft, unremarkable sound as the document sliding across the table. Marcellus sat with the signed amendment in front of him and decided she was being bitter. It was the most comfortable interpretation, and he was tired, and he needed to believe he had won something. That evening, he drove to his mother's house and began. He moved through the rooms with the systematic focus of a man who had been waiting to do exactly this. He photographed account statements. He opened drawers and sorted jewelry by apparent value. He made 2 piles, one to keep, one to donate. He was efficient. He told himself efficiency was respect, that lingering would only make it harder. In the back of his mother's bedroom dresser, behind a stack of folded scarves that still held her scent, he found a small velvet box. He opened it. Inside, a pearl brooch on a bed of ivory satin. He looked at it for perhaps 3 seconds, long enough to register that it was old, not long enough to wonder why it was there and not in the jewelry box with everything else. Costume jewelry, he thought, not worth cataloging. He set the velvet box on the donation pile and moved on. He did not look for it again. If you've ever watched someone walk away from a fight too quietly and felt the unease of it, that specific low-frequency wrongness, drop a comment below. Some silences aren't surrender, and the people who come back to this channel week after week already know that. If you're one of them, welcome back. If you're new here, stay, because what this story becomes is the reason this channel exists. On the drive home, the portfolio on the passenger seat beside him, Marcellus replayed the afternoon. The sound of the document, Ruben's careful neutrality, the way Seraphine had gathered her coat without rushing. He replayed her words. "Mom told me to let you have it, Marcellus. She said you'd need it more than I would." He had heard bitterness in it the first time, but somewhere on the highway, with the city lights smearing past his windows, he heard it again, and this time what struck him was not the words, but the tone. She had not sounded bitter. She had not sounded defeated. She had sounded, he realized, the way someone sounds when they are telling you the ending of a movie they have already seen. Driving home with the portfolio on his passenger seat, Marcellus replays Seraphine's exact words and realizes, for the first time, that she didn't sound defeated. She sounded like someone who already knew how this story ended. That unease lasted exactly 48 hours. Then Marcellus did what Marcellus had always done when a feeling didn't fit the story he was telling himself. He buried it under motion. Within 2 weeks of leaving Ruben Achara Finch's conference room, he had contacted 3 financial institutions and begun the process of liquidating the accounts listed in the estate documents. Savings. A certificate of deposit their mother had held for 11 years. A brokerage account small enough to be humbling, but large enough to matter. He moved through it all with the brisk efficiency of a man who has been waiting a long time for permission to begin. He told himself it was practical. The estate needed to be settled. Accounts needed to be closed. This was administration, not appetite. But then came the car. A charcoal gray sedan, 2 years newer than the one he'd been driving, purchased on a Thursday afternoon from a dealership where the salesman called him sir without hesitation and offered him coffee without being asked. Marcellus sat in the showroom and felt something loosen in his chest, something he hadn't realized had been clenched. Then came the apartment renovation. New kitchen fixtures, a sectional sofa in a shade of gray that the designer called warm concrete. He approved the invoice without asking for a second quote, which was new for him, and he noticed that it felt good, the not asking, the not flinching. He started hosting dinners, not large ones, 4 people, 6 people, the kind where the check arrives and he takes it before anyone else can reach. A cousin named Darius, a colleague from his old office, a woman he'd been seeing casually for the better part of a year. He was generous in the way that men are generous when they are also keeping score. Not of the money, but of the looks on people's faces when they realized he was the one paying. It was at one of these dinners, the one with Darius, that Seraphine's name came up. Darius asked carefully how she was doing. Marcellus said he wouldn't know. Darius waited. "She hasn't called," Marcellus said, refilling his glass. "Hasn't filed anything. Hasn't hired anyone. Nothing." He paused, and what crossed his face was not quite a smile. "Some people, when they know they lost, they go quiet. That's Seraphine. Always had too much pride to beg." Darius nodded slowly and changed the subject. Marcellus registered the nod and nothing else. What he did not register, what he could not have registered, because he was not the kind of man who looked for what wasn't there, was that Seraphine's silence was not the silence of someone who had accepted a loss. It was the silence of someone who had made a decision about how to spend the next several months and had nothing further to say until that work was done. But Marcellus was not thinking about Seraphine. Marcellus was thinking about a phone call he'd received that same week from a man named Whitmore Obie. Whitmore Obie was not a close friend, more of a long-standing acquaintance, the kind of man who appeared at the edges of Marcellus's life every few years with a handshake and a favor to ask or return. Several years back, Obie had been trying to get a contractor's license and needed a co-signer on the application, someone with a stable financial history and a clean record. Marcellus had obliged. It took 20 minutes and a notarized signature. He had not thought about it since. Obie called to thank him. Business was going well, he said. The license had opened doors. He was grateful. He wanted Marcellus to know that. Marcellus said it was nothing, meant it entirely, and hung up feeling the mild warmth of a man who has done a small good thing and is being reminded of it at a fortunate moment. He did not ask what doors the license had opened. He did not ask what the business was doing. It was nothing, a signature on a form. The kind of favor that costs nothing and means nothing and disappears into the ordinary history of a life. He went back to his coffee. 3 months passed in this register, full, forward-moving, loud enough in their dailiness to drown out most things. The portfolio sat on whatever surface was nearest, its leather growing no less worn, its interior now holding renovation invoices and car insurance documents instead of estate papers. Marcellus had stopped carrying it to meetings. He wasn't sure when. Seraphine still had not called, had not appeared in any court filing he could find, had not sent a letter, had not spoken to anyone in the family, as far as he could tell, about any of it. He mentioned this to Darius a second time on a different occasion, and Darius said, "Maybe she's just processing." Marcellus said, "She's had 4 months." Darius said, and looked at his phone. That stayed with him longer than it should have. Not because it meant anything, because it didn't. Because everyone in Marcellus's life had, at some point in the last 4 months, responded to the subject of Seraphine with a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite disagreement. A sound that closed the conversation without ending it. He was still turning that over when his phone rang. An unfamiliar number. He answered. A woman's voice, professional, slightly rushed, an assistant, the kind who manages a calendar and a reputation simultaneously. She asked if she was speaking with Reuben Achara Finch. Marcellus said no. A pause. Then, "I'm so sorry, I've dialed the wrong," and the line went dead. He stood there for a moment. The call had lasted 11 seconds. The woman had said almost nothing. There was no reason, no rational, grounded reason, for the cold that moved through him in the silence that followed. He told himself it was a misdial. People misdial. It meant nothing. But somewhere in the part of him that had replayed Seraphine's words on the drive home 4 months ago, she sounded like someone who already knew how this story ended. Somewhere in that part, a door had just opened a crack, letting in a draft from a room he had never thought to check. A certified letter had arrived that week at Reuben Achara Finch's office. It was addressed to Reuben, not to Marcellus. It bore the return address of a forensic document examination firm, and Marcellus only knew about it at all because a tired assistant had dialed one wrong digit and then, catching herself, had hung up before he could ask a single question. The call from Reuben's assistant had lasted 11 seconds. Long enough for Marcellus to hear her say his name, hear the small intake of breath when she realized her mistake, and hear the line go dead. He had called back 3 times. Each call went to voicemail. He told himself it was nothing, a misfiled letter, an administrative error that had nothing to do with him. He almost believed it. 3 days passed, then a week. He kept the portfolio close, the way he always did. On the passenger seat, on the table beside his plate, propped against the leg of his chair at the office. It had become less a habit and more a reassurance. The documents were inside. The amendment was inside. Everything was settled. Then the email arrived. No subject line, just his sister's name in the sender field. S. Dade-Okonkwo. 1 attachment, an audio file. No message in the body, not a word. He almost closed it. He would think about that later, the moment when he almost closed it, and wonder what version of himself would have emerged from that choice. He pressed play. The voice that came through the laptop speaker was his mother's, unmistakably. The particular weight of it, the way she drew breath before she spoke, the way her vowels rounded and settled. He had not heard it in 8 months. "Baby, I need you to let him have it. Let him have whatever he thinks he needs. He'll need it more than you will, and you and I both know that." Marcellus sat very still. Those were the words Seraphine had said to him in Reuben Achara Finch's conference room, almost exactly. The same sentence. He had heard them as contempt, as the parting shot of a woman who knew she had lost and wanted to make it sting. But this was not contempt. Celestia's voice was tired in a way he had never let himself register when she was alive. Not the tiredness of a long day. The tiredness of a woman who had been carrying something heavy for years and had finally set it down. Not because the weight was gone, but because she no longer had the time to carry it. She was not proud of what she was saying. She was not conspiring. She was grieving something she could see coming and could not stop. He played it again. The second time, he heard the exhaustion more clearly. The third time, he heard something underneath it. A specific, particular sadness that had nothing to do with the estate, nothing to do with money, nothing to do with the amendment or the conference room or any of it. It was the sadness of a mother who knew her son, who had always known him, who had loved him anyway, and who had quietly, without drama, made arrangements. The fourth time he played it, he heard the rest. The arrangement with Reuben will make sure you're protected regardless, baby. That part's already done. Just let him have it. The arrangement with Reuben. He played those 6 words back in his head without touching the laptop. Played them again. Turned them over the way you turn over a stone you have just stepped on and cannot quite identify. He had assumed from the beginning that Reuben Achara Finch was simply their mother's estate attorney, a functionary, a man who filed documents and notarized signatures and sent invoices. He had never thought to ask whether Reuben was something else, whether Celestia had asked him to be something else. Marcellus called him at 9:47 that morning. Reuben picked up on the second ring, which meant he had been expecting the call. "I need to know what the arrangement was," Marcellus said. He did not bother with a greeting. "My mother mentioned it in a voicemail, an arrangement with you. I need to know what that means." There was a pause, not the pause of a man caught off guard, but the pause of a man selecting his words with the care of someone who has been careful for a very long time. "Marcellus." Reuben's voice was measured and not unkind. "I'm not in a position to discuss that with you at this time. She's my mother. That's my estate." "I understand your position." Another pause. "What I'd recommend, strongly, is that you retain your own counsel, someone who represents your interests specifically, before this goes any further." Before this goes any further. Marcellus asked what that meant. Reuben said he had already said what he could say. Marcellus asked again. Reuben said, gently, that he hoped Marcellus had a good day and ended the call. He stood at the window for a long time after that. Long enough for the light to shift. Long enough for the coffee to go cold on the table behind him. He had spent months telling himself a particular story, that the amendment corrected something, that their mother had always intended for him to have more, that Seraphine's inheritance was an oversight, a product of a period when Celestia was unwell and susceptible to influence, and that what he had done was simply restore the natural order of things. He pulled the amendment from the portfolio, set it under the desk lamp the way you set something under a light when you are finally ready to look at it properly. He had looked at this document dozens of times. He knew every line. He had been proud of it, in the specific way a man is proud of something he believes proves a point about himself. He looked at it now with his mother's voice still in his ears, with Reuben's careful pause still in the room, and he saw, for the first time, in the lower left corner of the page, half hidden under the margin, a coffee ring stain. Faint, a perfect pale circle pressed into the paper. He looked at the ink of the signature above it. The ink sat on top of the stain. The coffee ring was in the paper. The signature was on top of it. He did not move. He did not reach for his phone. He did not close the portfolio. He simply sat there, under the lamp, looking at the thing he had built, and at the small, quiet fact that had been sitting inside it all along, waiting for someone to look closely enough to find it. He already knew. That was the part he could never admit to anyone afterward. That somewhere beneath the months of spending and celebrating and telling himself the story he needed to believe, he had always known what that coffee ring meant. The ink sat on top of the stain, not under it, on top. Paper ages. Ink does not age backwards. And a man who had spent 3 years watching a forger work, not knowing that was what he was watching, telling himself it was just a favor, just a signature on a form, understood, in the quiet of that kitchen, exactly what he had done. He put the amendment back into the portfolio. He closed the clasp. He went to bed. He did not sleep. The filing arrived on a Tuesday. Reuben Achara Finch's assistant called Marcellus at 8:47 in the morning, not by mistake this time, not a wrong number, but because Reuben had instructed her to. Seraphine Dade-Okonkwo had filed a formal will contest in the county probate court, supported by a forensic document examination report commissioned 8 months prior. 8 months. Marcellus read the report in his car, parked outside his apartment building, engine off. He read it twice. The examiner, a court-certified specialist with 23 years of question document work, had used a technique called optical luminescence dating on the paper fibers and cross-referenced the ink's polymer degradation against the amendment's stated signing date of March 14th. The ink was younger than the paper, by at least 14 months. Someone had taken a pre-aged page, a page that looked old because it was old, because it had been sitting somewhere long enough to acquire a water ring from a coffee mug, and signed it afterward. The paper's age was real. The signature's age was not, but the ink was not the worst of it. The notary stamp, the official seal that made the amendment a witnessed, legally authenticated document, bore the registration number of a notary public named Gerald Witten, licensed in the county, whose stamp Marcellus had somehow obtained. Gerald Witten had died on November 9th. The amendment was dated March 14th of the following year. A dead man had notarized a living document. Or rather, someone had needed the world to believe that he had. Marcellus had spent 3 chapters of his own life telling himself he had found a loophole, a technicality, something that was perhaps not elegant, perhaps not the way their mother would have wanted it, but not wrong, not in the way that mattered, not in the way that had a name. It had a name. He sat in that car for 40 minutes. Then he drove to Reuben Achara Finch's office. Reuben did not begin with the forgery. He began with the arrangement. He said the word carefully, the way a doctor says a diagnosis, not to wound, but because precision is the only mercy available. Celestia Dade's original will, Reuben explained, had left the estate in its entirety to Seraphine, not because Celestia loved Marcellus less, because she understood him more clearly than he had ever understood himself. She had watched her son spend 38 years reaching for things he hadn't yet built the foundation to hold. And she had loved him enough to build the foundation for him, quietly, without his knowledge, so that his pride would remain intact. The private discretionary trust, structured by Reuben at Celestia's direction in the final year of her life, would have provided Marcellus a monthly living stipend, enough to cover his debts, enough to keep him stable while he figured out what he actually wanted to do with his life. Administered by Seraphine, who had agreed to serve as trustee not because she was given authority over her brother, but because she was the one person their mother trusted to use that authority with kindness rather than leverage. Marcellus would never have known the trust existed unless Seraphine told him. Seraphine would have told him. He had not stolen from someone who didn't need it. He had not outmaneuvered a system that was unfair to him. He had reached into the mechanism his mother built to protect him, and he had destroyed it, piece by piece, with his own hands, because he could not tolerate the idea of receiving something through Seraphine's grace. Reuben let the silence sit. He was good at that. Finally, Marcellus asked the only question he could form. Did she know? When I walked in with the amendment, did Seraphine already know? Reuben picked up his pen, set it down again. She had commissioned the forensic examination 6 weeks before you filed the amendment with the court. She was waiting for the report to be complete. 8 months. She had sat across from him in that conference room and watched him slide the forged amendment across the table. And she had said, "Let him have it. Mom said he'd need it more than I would." And she had already known. She had already been building the case. She had not raised her voice. She had not called him. She had not filed a single emergency motion or sent a single accusatory email. She had simply gone home and continued to wait, with a patience so complete it was almost incomprehensible to him now. He sat in the car for a long time after leaving Reuben's office. He thought about discipline, about what it actually cost to stay silent for 8 months when you knew, when you had always known, and to simply wait for the truth to arrive on its own schedule rather than forcing it into the room before it was ready. He had never done anything that required that kind of patience. He had never trusted anything enough to wait for it. Seraphine had trusted the truth. She had trusted that it would surface. She had trusted, maybe, that Marcellus would eventually have to sit in a parking lot somewhere and understand what he had actually done. Not what he had told himself he had done, not the version he had rehearsed for cousins over dinner, but the real thing, with its real name. He understood it now. He reached for his phone. There were 2 missed calls from a number he didn't recognize, and a voicemail. He listened to it once, a civil plaintiff's attorney, calling on behalf of a client. The name on the filing was Whitmore Obie. The matter concerned a contractor's license. co-signed years ago by Marcellus Dade-Okonkwo, and the civil damages arising from fraud committed under its authority. The name Whitmore Obie had been nothing to Marcellus. A favor from years ago, a signature on a licensing form, a phone call that lasted 4 minutes, a small generosity he had mentioned almost as a footnote during the flush months when he still believed the story was going his way. He had not thought about it since. He thought about it now. The civil complaint against Whitmore Obie was 41 pages. Marcellus's name appeared on page 7. Obie had operated under the co-sign license for 3 years after Marcellus signed the application, and in that time he had collected deposits from 14 clients for renovation work he never completed. The damages sought across those 14 claims totaled $230,000. Because Marcellus's name was on the licensing application, because he had vouched, formally and in writing, for a man he had not checked on since, the plaintiff's attorney had named him as a jointly liable party. The liquid cash from the estate, the accounts he had liquidated, the balances he had photographed and inventoried with such careful satisfaction, amounted to just under $280,000 after legal fees from the will contest. The Obie judgment, when it came, consumed most of it. What remained was swallowed almost immediately by the second order. The family home had been sold to a development group called Meridian Urban Partners within 60 days of probate closing. Marcellus had taken $240,000 for a property appraised at $310,000. He had not disclosed in any filing that he carried a personal loan from one of Meridian's principals, a debt from 4 years earlier, renegotiated quietly when he needed breathing room. The forensic accountant working the estate review found the loan in 11 minutes. The fraudulent conveyance claim that followed required Marcellus to disgorge the $70,000 gap between sale price and appraised value. He did not have $70,000 left to disgorge. Reuben Achara Finch requested one final meeting, not as opposing counsel, not as the estate's representative. He came as the man who had drawn up Celestia Dade-Okonkwo's original will, who had sat with her in this same building, in a room very much like this one, and listened to her describe her 2 children with the careful, unsentimental love of a woman who knew exactly what she was looking at. He set the manila folder on the table and did not open it. "There's something you should know," Reuben said. "Not for the proceedings. Those are finished. For you." He told Marcellus what Seraphine had been doing during the final 2 years of their mother's life. Celestia's medical debt had accumulated quietly. A specialist in the 2nd year, a home care arrangement in the last 8 months, prescriptions, equipment, the small indignities that illness charges by the week. The total across 26 months was just over $94,000. Seraphine had paid it, month by month, out of her own savings without telling Celestia, without telling Marcellus, without telling anyone. She had not wanted their mother to spend her last months watching the family's finances and worrying about whether the son who had stopped answering the finance calls would be asked to contribute. She wasn't comfortable, Reuben said. She was emptied out, and she never told your mother because she didn't want Celestia to spend her last months worrying about you. Marcellus had told himself, across all the months of this, across the amendment and the liquidations and the sale and the litigation, that Seraphine would be fine. She was always the capable one, the one who landed. The inheritance was a windfall for her, a comfort, a bonus on top of a life that was already working. He had needed it, she had not. He sat with that story for a moment longer. Then he let it go because it was no longer possible to hold it. The inheritance was not a windfall. It was the only way she was ever going to get back what she had spent keeping their mother alive and their mother at peace. He had not taken from someone who didn't need it. He had taken from someone who had already given everything she had. He saw her on the courthouse steps after the final hearing. She was wearing the brooch. He had inventoried it in Chapter 1 of his own story, opened the velvet box, turned it over once, decided it was costume jewelry, not worth cataloging, and dropped it into a donation bag without a second thought. He had been wrong about its value the same way he had been wrong about almost everything else. Celestia had given it to Seraphine in person months before she died because she had known, with the clear-eyed certainty of a woman who had been cataloging everything she saw for 68 years, that Marcellus would take everything else. The brooch was the only thing Seraphine had wanted. It had never been in the estate to contest. She didn't speak. She didn't move toward him. She looked at him the way she had looked at him in Reuben's conference room on the day he slid the amendment across the table. That long, measuring look he had read as resignation, and later as contempt, and now, finally, understood for what it actually was. It was the look of someone who already knew the whole story, who had known it from the first page, who had been waiting, with great sadness and extraordinary patience, for him to catch up. He had caught up. It had cost him everything to get here, and the knowledge he arrived with was not the kind that made a person feel smarter. It was the kind that settled into the chest and stayed. He drove home alone. The portfolio sat on the passenger seat the way it always had, the nervous companion he had carried into every room where he needed to appear like a man who had things in order. It was empty now. There was nothing left to carry in it, and no room that would be impressed by it, and he was not sure he would ever fill it again with anything worth the wait. The apartment he was driving toward would have to be vacated within the month. The car was leased. The renovation on the apartment he had announced to 3 different people at dinner during the flush months had never been scheduled. The lifestyle he had been performing had always been a performance, and the inheritance was supposed to be the moment the performance became real, and instead it had been the moment the performance collapsed under its own weight and took the stage with it. He kept returning to one question on the drive. Not what he had lost. He knew exactly what he had lost, down to the dollar, and the dollar was almost beside the point now. The question was smaller and heavier than money. What would he have had if he had simply let his mother's plan stand? The stipend, the debts covered. Seraphine managing it with the same quiet discipline she had brought to 26 months of medical payments he never knew about, never asked about, never thought to ask about. He would have had the safety net his mother built specifically because she knew him, knew the portfolio was a habit, and the dress shirts were a performance, and the man inside them was someone who needed structure more than he needed freedom. She had known, she had arranged for it, and he had destroyed it, methodically and by hand, because he could not stand the idea that his little sister was the one holding the net. That was the accounting. Not the legal fees or the disgorgement orders or the civil judgment, those were just the arithmetic. The real accounting was this. A woman had spent 2 years quietly emptying herself out to protect her mother from worry and her brother from shame, and her brother had spent 8 months congratulating himself on her silence. The truth had not arrived loudly. It never did. It arrived in a forensic examiner's report, in a voicemail played 4 times under a desk lamp, in a pearl brooch worn to a courthouse in broad daylight by a woman who had nothing left to prove and no interest in proving it. Justice, when it finally came, did not look like victory for anyone. It looked like a man alone in a car at dusk, holding a question he would carry for the rest of his life, understanding at last that the story was never about the money. It was about what a person does when they think no one is watching. And Celestia Dade had been watching. She had always been watching. She had built the whole plan around what she saw. Some stories end with a gavel. Some end with a check. This one ended with a man driving home through a city that did not know his name, carrying an empty portfolio and a question his mother had already answered. Years ago, in a will, in an arrangement, in a voicemail, in a brooch placed in the right hands before it was too late. She had known exactly what she was doing. She always had. If this story sat with you, if you recognize something in it, something about what we tell ourselves when we think we've won, drop a word in the comments. Even just the word brooch, you'll know why. The people who watch to the end of a story like this are the ones who understand that truth doesn't always arrive loudly. Subscribe and stay with us, because that's the kind of story we tell here, every time.